Welcome to my big break, and congratulations on making it to a session at 10 a.m. on a Saturday morning after a Friday night in Sheffield. So it's nice to see you all here. Thank you very much for coming along. This session is supported by BAFTA. You all know BAFTA from the awards, but they're a festival partner, and they do so much more than the awards ceremonies. This is part of their Learning and New Talent Development scheme, program, and it's to showcase and support emerging talent and also share excellence from people already established in the industry, hence our fantastic panel here. So thank you very much. I'm just going to very quickly introduce you to everybody. So at the end, we've got Lizzie Cohen, who is director of the BAFTA-nominated Kingdom of Us. Then we've got here, then second in, we've got Ayo Akingbade, who is the director of Street 66, which is showing in Sheffield here. Then we've got Elhum Shakerifar. Elhum Shakerifar, who produced the film that was on the opening night, A Northern Soul, which is also showing again on Monday, and also produced A Syrian Love Story. And then we've got Ed Perkins, whose film Black Sheep is also showing as part of the festival tonight. He's also a director. So what we're going to do is we're going to start off by showing you a little bit of their work, then we'll have some questions which I will ask, and then we'll throw it open to the floor, and you can ask whatever questions you want of the panel. And the point of this session is for you really to understand how you get into the industry, how you launch your career, how you get your film seen and made. That's sort of the point of the session. But obviously you can ask any question you want. So we'll play the clips. It's probably first worth you probably all just telling us a little bit about the work we've just seen. So do you want to start, Lucy?
Yeah, sure. Kingdom of Us is a film about a family of 7 siblings and their mother. Their father killed himself 8 years ago, and the film follows them over 3 years as they sort of, I guess, look to the past, piece together the very different memories they have, and try to sort of forge a way to into the future. And it sort of weaves together observational documentary, archive, and to sort of tell their story.
Okay. And Ayo?
Tower XYZ played last year, and it's about gentrification in Hackney. And the other clip was a commission that I got from ICA called A's for Artists, and it's a personal piece dedicated to my dad.
Okay. Elhum?
So that was a clip from Even When I Fall by Sky Neal and Kate McLarnon, which is a film about Nepal's first circus, which was set up by survivors of trafficking. And it's a film I produced, well, it was made over 7 years. It screened at DocFest last year, and I also distributed the film earlier this year.
And Ed, Black Sheep?
So Black Sheep is a short film about a young black boy called Cornelius, whose family moved out of London after the killing of Damilola Taylor. And the film explores the somewhat extraordinary lengths he goes in order to survive a series of racist attacks.
I'm interested about your sort of motivation. What drives you all to do what you do? I don't know, do you want to start with Elhum?
I'm really interested in challenging mainstream narratives. I feel like the stories that we're told by, well, the news, people who generally have the stage, are simplified, stereotypical, and have never really represented the realities that I see around me. So as a producer, I look to try and work with people who are telling stories in a more interesting way, and to look for the more distinctive or kind of the subtler voices. And generally, all the films that I've worked on have been about something that really grabbed me and moved me. And, you know, Even When I Fall was made over 7 years. I wasn't involved in the whole 7 years. I think I worked on it for about 5. A Syrian Love Story was made over 5 years. A Northern Soul is actually one of the shortest films. You know, we've been talking about it and looking into it, and probably Sean has been on the longest journey with that film. But that was a much shorter process. But in any case, if you're going to jump in with a film, you know, a more verite-based documentary, then it's going to generally take a long time, and you need to really know why you're doing it. So it's something you really believe in.
You say you sort of like the sort of quieter narratives, the ones that are outside the mainstream. Are those harder to get made?
Yeah, absolutely, because the mainstream ultimately is what's funding you and endorsing you and validating you, and actually the quieter voices are the ones that generally are harder to fund, because you need to make quite a lot of film before anyone jumps on board with you, particularly if you're a first-time director. So I think that's one of the things that shocks me the most. You know, we talk in the industry of these ideas of like being bold and radical and looking for fresh new talent, but actually enabling fresh new talent is very challenging, because you need to have to, you know, how do you prove yourself before you know, how does that, so there's this concept of how would you trust someone with funding when you can't see what they can do? But for me as a producer, you think, well, there's a great idea there, there's this energy, there's an approach, there's an access maybe, or a connection to a subject, and what you need to find is the team or the different elements to enable that story to be told in its own terms, in its own words. But yeah, the challenges with getting the mainstream to come on board.
Okay. What drives you, Ayo?
Lots of things. But the reason why I started making films was because I wasn't seeing stuff that I wanted to see, nothing about my experience. As a British Nigerian person, there's hardly anything unless I'm a musician, there's music. And so at the moment I'm exploring social housing because I'm not seeing stories that I can relate to, and experiences from my friends, we're not seeing that. So that's my prime focus, and hopefully when I finish this trilogy, then I can move on to a comedy. I'm quite funny, I think, but at the moment it's very serious because I feel like there's a time bomb in my head that the environment is changing at such a rapid pace that I need to capture it, unless it won't be there tomorrow. So what inspires me is that literally just sharing stories of people who are buried, and making sure that people from my community get to see that and relate, because I like it when people watch, even when Tower and 66 played in Rotterdam and in Toronto, people who were not Black British, who are not Black, still got the essence, and I think that's really important.
What about you, Lizzie? What drives you?
I think that a lot of the work that I've made and the things that I sort of care about have sort of mental health, mental illness as a kind of a core theme. And since being a teenager, really, that's something that I guess has interested me, but also where I've felt that our kind of understanding or the kind of dialogue around that perhaps could shift. And some of my work has looked at that in more direct ways. And now I guess sort of, you know, I'm always sort of interested in doing things where the kind of the psychological kind of layers and what it's sort of going into are quite a focus, but sort of now doing things where it's perhaps kind of less kind of direct in a sense. So I think, yeah, I think that's a kind of what I look for in the work that I do.
Okay. What about you? What's your purpose, Ed?
I think we probably all want to tell stories that that we feel deserve to be told, and that other people might not tell if it wasn't for us. But I think also, like when I'm looking for a story anyway, I know that it's probably going to take up the next year or 2 or 3 or 4 years of my life, and so it's got to be a story that somewhat obsesses me and that I found totally captivating and couldn't imagine not making. And sounds a bit cheesy, but it's got to sort of make me think, but more importantly, it's got to make me feel and emote, and I've got to want to go and spend time with that community or that person for the next 4 years and really kind of go on the journey with them. The first film I made was 4 years in the making, kind of weekends and evenings, and you do need a certain kind of obsessiveness to kind of keep going back and spending time with people, especially when you haven't got funding and you're not sure what the film's going to turn into. But often, as you're starting out in the industry, that's the only way to kind of get your first project out there. Is you just got to you've got to take the initiative, you've got to grab it, and you've got to go and make it. No one else is going to kind of make it for you. So you've got to kind of drive it with that passion.
So how did you, so I'm interested in sort of roots into the industry, so continue from what you're saying, Ed. Yeah. So how did you get into the industry? Did you go to film school? How did you learn to make documentaries?
So I didn't go to film school. I went to university in America and studied politics, and but when I was there, I learned to shoot on kind of small format cameras. So Canon 5D Mark II was the camera at the time, which is like a small DSLR. It was relatively cheap. And you could shoot these amazing films on it. So I saved up my money, bought one of those, and then became one of those filmmakers that could kind of be sent anywhere in the world with a backpack full of a couple of lenses, a microphone, and I could just go off and do it on my own. So, I could shoot, well, not desperately well, but I learned to shoot, I learned to edit, I learned to record sound, so I could just be sent off and come back and create these pieces of work on my own. And I think that was a massive advantage, not only for the first company I worked for was National Geographic, so they employed me as a development exec, just kind of sending me around the place, kind of developing stories, but also because I had my own little camera, I could start to shoot my own film, and that's kind of how my first sort of breakthrough film happened, I guess, was just in weekends and evenings with my own equipment, without any funding, just going off and starting to make the thing.
So you just went and did it. You didn't say, commissioning editor, will you commission it? You just went out and made it.
I think I met him in a pub. It's about this slightly eccentric man who goes up to Scotland looking for buried treasure. And I met him in a pub and just felt there was something there and had no idea where this story was going to go. But again, kind of became obsessed with him and his passion and his journey, and just felt like it was worth spending time with him. And I think we did talk to some commissioners at that point, but it was too big a risk. I'd never made a film before. They had no idea where the story was going to go. And probably like all of us, it's hard to expect that someone's going to throw a load of money at you with a story like that without any experience. So I just started shooting it. And by the time we then got the commission, 2.5 years later, we had 85% of the film kind of already shot, and we were starting to edit. So a lot of the kind of hard work was already done by that point. But the only way is just to go find your stories and just go and start making it.
You had a more traditional route in, didn't you, Lucy, through sort of television production?
Yeah, I didn't sort of study filmmaking, but history and then print journalism. And then I started working as a researcher for a production company called Diverse, which existed then, as a researcher on documentaries, and then as assistant producer, and then kind of director, and kind of went through that that way. I directed my first film for Channel 4 First Cut scheme 10 years ago.
Which is a new director's strand, isn't it?
Which is a new director's strand as well. And I mean, even then, that's quite an authored film too. And it was a story, and it was a subject that I really cared about. And even that, you kind of get funded to make it, but it's very much as it's sort of supporting you as a director. I mean, it was really tough. I mean, I remember it took me a long time, and at the end of it, I kind of worked out that I had managed to sort of pay myself £50 a week for, throughout the period of it. I mean, it was really difficult. And likewise, Kingdom of Us, I worked on for 2 years before we had any funding that came in. And and had to sort of really get out there and do a lot of the work. But at the same time, I think sometimes for the films that you kind of really care about, and where you have a real kind of, a real personal draw and connection that flows kind of both ways between the subject and what you're doing, that's sometimes actually being given lots of funding and having a commission at the outset comes with certain demands, and can be difficult as well to fit into that schedule. You have like different voices coming in then as well. And actually, when I started making Kingdom of Us and went to the traditional broadcasters, Channel 4 and the BBC to begin with, nobody was interested. It was probably a very good thing, because I had 2 years to just slowly kind of explore the story, as much as it felt tough. and it felt lonely, it wouldn't be the film that it is now if it hadn't had that kind of period in the wilderness. So I think it's difficult, it's hard, but sometimes just being alone and like needing to dig in and really kind of search can actually, help you to sort of find something really sort of special as well.
Okay. And what about you, Ayo? How did you get into filmmaking, the industry?
Went to film school, which was a weird experience. I graduated last year.
So
But before that, I was an intern, was working in production companies, like on my summer breaks.
okay. And Elhum?
So probably quite different to everyone else. I'm a producer.
Yeah.
I actually studied Persian literature and then went to work in a community centre for about 10 years before working with films. But I kind of fell into filmmaking half, but I heard about a film that a friend was making about a long-distance runner from the Western Sahara, and I felt really embarrassed that I didn't realise that the Western Sahara, where it was and what the story around it was. And I started to fundraise for it, which was essentially using those skills that I was developing in the community centre I worked in, and slowly became that film's producer because, well, it didn't have a producer. But I pitched it in every possible festival we could take it to. I wrote so many funding applications, and I started to realize that there are narratives that are told and narratives that aren't told. And I thought that film would be my baptism of fire. And then every film since then has been another baptism of fire. So, but that was the first one. And but I think storytelling was really the key, from literature to working in a community centre to working with films as a kind of creative, strategic producer.
Okay. It's quite interesting because both Ed, quite a lot of you, well, in fact, the three of the directors, you all shoot your own stuff, don't you? You're all actually there holding the camera. And is that a necessity because you don't have the funding, or is that a sort of style that you all prefer?
It's probably a bit of both. I mean, I don't know. It felt like maybe 10, 15 years ago that wasn't necessarily the way, and that directors would be able to work with camera, with cinematographers, but I don't know whether it's a budget thing now. Maybe budgets are tighter. I at least feel like a lot of the stuff that we do that's sort of observational, where you're going and spending time with people or communities, the best films come from the strength of the relationship between you as a filmmaker and the people whose story you're telling, and it's about trust and authenticity, and building that relationship is at the heart of everything. And so I've at least felt that if it's just me with a little camera, with a little microphone on the top, and there's nothing else, there's no lights, there's no other people with holding tripods and stuff, that allows me to kind of build a very strong relationship with contributors quickly. So that's the kind of reason I've kept it small and decided to shoot.
What about you, Lizzie? Because obviously you had a family with 7 children, and it's a big old cast.
Yeah, no, indeed. I think, similar to Ed, kind of a mixture of both. Initially, I guess in getting to know the family as well, just being me, you can develop those relationships. I was a bit more free to just, to come and go. And then, I mean, by the time funding was there, where there could have been an option to change that, we were already kind of comfortable in that arrangement, and it would have felt strange for somebody else to come in then. I think that it definitely, in that case, has its challenges, particularly with sound, because I've got a top mic and 1 radio mic, and 7 kids and the mum, and so many times the person with the radio mic will have forgot they've had it on, and they've gone to meet their boyfriend, and then I've got radio mic, and there's like loads of different rooms, and they've got like 8 cats and 2 dogs, and a really loud fridge and washing machine, and the TV's always on, and just the mix was pretty long, and they definitely would have said I could have done with a sound person, but but I don't know. It's weighing it up. I certainly wouldn't have changed that either. I think. I mean, I worked with the DOP on some of the more sort of stylized shots and sort of capturing the house and the landscape as a character, but he wasn't, filming with them as well. And I think it's the style too. If you're not doing master interviews, but something that's more conversational, that felt kind of more appropriate.
Okay. What about you, Ayo?
Yeah, I'm not a self-shooter, but I do everything but use the camera because I'm not technical like that. I think someone else should do that. But I produce, I do everything, all the research and stuff. But I think that the reason why I do that is because obviously it's money constraints, like to get a camera, hire that. Like I would rather prefer to like, I don't know, meet the people I'm interviewing prior and like make sure their story is concrete rather than checking up if I've got the right f-stop or the right lens. And also with the DOP, I tell him like what I aspire the image to look like, and it's like a collaboration on what he can do and what's feasible with whatever camera we have. And I think hopefully I can continue to work like that.
Okay. Yeah. Your films, I mean, across all of you, that your films have really strong protagonists and, the really interesting worlds. I mean, how, if people want to know how to find stories or how to find characters, how do you do it? Who wants to go? Go on, Elhum, you want to go. How do you, how did you find Only When I Fall? How did you find the people there?
Well, I think it all starts with the directors, really, and what's their drive to tell the stories they want to tell. And what is driving them, what's their draw. Even When I Fall started because Sky, one of the co-directors, was a circus performer herself and was going to do some volunteering in a circus in India and found out that circus had a history of trafficking. And so she'd never heard of that reality, and so went to Nepal to a refuge where kids were being rescued and taken to instead. And it was the relationship. She didn't go there necessarily as either a circus performer or as a filmmaker. She went with that kind of dual hat, but also just to support the refuge and see what she could do. It was the relationship that was built with one of the first girls she met that started the idea that a film could develop from this, which was very much around the surprise that Saraswati, this young woman, had at seeing a circus performer who is a performer out of choice.
Right.
And so to explore this idea of using the skills of circus to redefine a victim of a representation of victimhood, as is generally connected to stories of trafficking. So that was the beginning of that journey. With, say, a Syrian love story, that was Sean, having worked in the Middle East over years, thinking that there was nothing really representing Syria and understanding its governments. Over, since the 30 years of the Assad regime, there's never been very much questioning of how that regime works. And that film started in 2010, and he went out to see whether he can tell a different story. And I think I kind of, as a producer, I gravitate towards stories that really challenge that mainstream narrative. Yeah. And so directors who have a really clear sense of what it is they're trying to find or what it is they're trying to say is what interests me the most. And sometimes you don't know exactly what it is at the beginning of the journey. You don't know necessarily what you're going to find, but you know what's driving you. And I think that's the key. And as a producer, you need to know why you're involved as well, because the journey might be really long. So you also need to work out where you stand, because it's going to be hard.
and I guess also as well the challenge of maintaining relationships with your protagonists as well, because the family. How long did you film the Shank family for?
Well, I met them in summer 2013, and then the film was released sort of last year, so it was filming over sort of 4 years. And I think, I think sort of just picking up on what Elhum was saying as well is, in that case, I kind of met this family who were incredibly, they were warm, funny, large families are kind of fascinating in themselves, and they were all very sort of articulate in kind of different ways, and there was a lot going on there. For on the autistic spectrum, they'd lost their father. There was, one of the challenges, I think, in early on in kind of getting funding is it was very messy. The family is very messy and it's very chaotic, and there's a lot of them. And I think I felt very drawn to them as characters, and knew that this was a very special environment and there was something important to say, and there were strong themes there, but I didn't know kind of what the story was. And I think that's something that it probably arrive at things, like there's a lot that I don't know, but there's a connection there, and there's something that, you feel needs to be said. One of the things I've actually found in applying for funding is really working on why I feel I need to tell that story has really helped. And sometimes the reason that I found, like, why I have that connection, it might not be evident on screen. It might be in a small detail of a moment or a character, but it's just something that really helps funders kind of understand how you're going to kind of bring it through. And in terms of just maintaining relationships, we're very close, and the film really is a sort of a collaboration in the sense, they saw the cut kind of a lot of times throughout it, and it's difficult. I guess some people have certain like rules with contributors. To me, they're just friends, and they've become friends, and we're friends, and that's kind of how it works, really.
Does that mean it's difficult? Do you ever get in situations where they want a scene not in the film and you want a scene in the film? How does that work if you've got?
Well, I generally and everybody's different, but I tend to always say we'll see the film, and if you don't want something in it, it won't be in it. Right. That's okay. It's like their lives are way more important than the film, and they ultimately the ones that live with it. They're there on screen, and it's particularly for something that's so intensely personal and so extremely sensitive. That helps in terms of filming because they're not vetoing themselves as they're speaking, and creating something that's authentic, that's so important. We film really difficult things, but the other advantage of something being over a period of time, they came to understand when that situation resolves itself after the fall, when they've risen again, they understand how important it was to have captured the fall. And they got that. So even though things felt tough, they could understand that it was important in a certain way. And there was one thing that, there was a line that one of the girls didn't want in, which was fine, it didn't mean anything, but other than that, they didn't. There's things that they don't like watching, and it's difficult, but they understand why it's in there. So, and I think that's kind of, they knew it wasn't about liking everything, but
Has anyone got anything else to add about how they work with contributors?
Well, finding contributors is like the $1 million question, because it's like character is king, and finding stories is like more than half the battle, I think, which is why, especially as a young filmmaker, if you do find a story that captivates you, you need to keep it close and fight for it, because otherwise someone else will come in and take that story, or it will never be told, which would be even worse. So I think a lot of it is about building your own taste and trusting your own gut instincts and judgment. And if you meet someone who has and you feel like their story is fascinating and deserves to be told, then at least I've always trusted that other people would might feel the same, and that it was worth fighting for. I think in terms of maintaining relationships, at least the way we work it is all about trust. And I think just it's sort of not talked about much, but just being nice and authentic and genuine and friendly and a normal person and treating people with respect is massively important to building these relationships. And sometimes that can get lost with f-stops and cameras and lighting and all the rest of it. But actually, as a director or a producer, just building as normal as they can be given what you're doing, but proper relationships with people where they trust that they can say really sensitive things on camera and that you're not going to mess them around, and that you're going to portray them in a truthful, sensitive light, I think is really, really key. So that's been very key for us. Yeah.
What about you, Ayo? Because you're often working with communities who might not feel that ordinarily they're portrayed fairly in the media. So how do you sort of build trust with them?
With Street 66, it's about Dora Batema, who passed away in 2001. When I did approach her family and her friends, they were a bit aggy because they thought I was like part of an institution like the BBC, and would I be making money out of this and all that. But then once we started meeting up, and me talking about where I'm from, and like our backgrounds are really similar, and I want Dora's story to be celebrated, and I'm like open, ask me anything. They then opened up and then started referring me to other people, and the trust, building up trust was at first a bit shaky, but once they understood that I'm genuinely like quite a nice person, they were really open. And I think most importantly, people want to be acknowledged, and I feel like they want someone to care. And so if you're really passionate about a story and you share your vision with whoever you want to make the story about, and they can sense it, I think it'll be very easy for you to do it. Whereas if you're like, I've got so much money, it's going to be great, then they might like be a bit hesitant at first.
Yeah, I mean, interesting what you're saying about kind of, I think it's another thing about if you perhaps don't have the funding or don't have the commission, that can also be a kind of downside to begin with when you come in with. I mean, I remember with the family, because we didn't know who would see it or where it would go or anything like that. Actually, it was kind of an asset in terms of how low-key the filming was as well. I mean, I remember in one Q&A after the film went out, Nikita, one of the kids in the family, one of the questions was about how they felt about filming, and she said, sometimes Lucy would turn up and I just might not be in the mood. If I'd known it was going to be on Netflix, usually it would have been filmed. And which was great that she didn't know and we didn't know, because it helped them for it to feel. You want people to feel that it's so strange being filmed, but as much as possible to feel like it's just their lives and this isn't necessarily, a film until it comes to the end of it. So in almost not knowing our audience, that helped to a certain degree.
Okay. Go on, Son.
I was just going to say one other thing, which is that I remember when I was starting out, and you hear directors who are a bit older talk about how they build relationships, and I always found it quite kind of scary, as though there was a sort of a guidebook that you have to read in order to build relationships and tell stories. And for me, at least, the truth is that we all probably do it in very different ways, depending on our own personalities. And I think that's fine. And I've worked alongside other directors who take a totally different approach to me. And some of us will disclose lots of personal stuff about ourselves to our contributors, so that it feels like there's a sort of reciprocity there and that we're both giving. Other directors will be a bit of more of a closed book and just listen. And I think all of those approaches are fine, and they all end up with different kind of films. So I don't think anyone should feel like they're they're having to kind of try to become like another director. The exciting thing, at least for me, making observational films is how the course of your early career you change the way that you interact with contributors, and you learn from mistakes that you've made, and you sort of build your own way of telling these stories and building these relationships, and that's really exciting.
Yeah. Have you got anything to add?
But I think this idea of not trying to do what other people do is a really good point. That I work with many different directors. They all have completely different approaches to things, completely different approaches to working with people, but also the way that they film, the way that they interact, even with me and what I bring to that process. So you find your own voice by working it out, you know. And actually, every single film has its own set of challenges, in a sense. I think over the years, I've probably just become much more calm about everything. So the last couple of days, people have just been saying, "You look really calm. Is everything okay?" And I think it's because I've produced a number of films now, and so I feel like, things go wrong sometimes. Things will happen. We just have to address them. And every film presents a brand new set of challenges, and there will be problems. And we make documentaries, we respond to reality, we respond to the real world, and we work with real people, and that's where our responsibilities lie. But you can only, so there's a kind of, I think, I can't remember where I started that, but I think I'm very calm. Yeah. Now I'm very calm. Essentially, what I was trying to say is that every single film is going to be different, so be responsive to the situations that it poses, and don't try and be anyone else, just try and respond to it in a way that you work through things yourself, and you know where you stand, and that's the main thing. And it goes back to the very beginning of our conversation around the time that it can sometimes take to get partners on board is the time that you work out exactly what you're trying to say and how you want to say it, and those partners can help you say it better, maybe, but you're standing firm in one place. Rather than being kind of pulled in lots of directions with other people on board giving their opinion.
We're going to throw it open to the audience a minute, but I just wanted to get a sense of, because obviously now you are all very successful, and I want to know I get a sense of some of the mistakes you've made, things that you sort of wish you'd known when you started out. Have you made no mistakes?
Made loads.
But what is success? I don't think I'm successful yet. I don't have a mortgage, I'm joking.
Yeah. Or what advice would you give to people starting out? What sort of things, what advice would you give to people starting out?
I think it echoes what we've said kind of already, but I think I would just say, don't wait for or expect kind of permission to make a film, that neither makes it kind of good nor successful, or if you have something that you really want to say and something you want to make, then just get out and do it. I guess there are lots of different ways to work in the industry, but I think probably I spent a period of feeling quite frustrated that I was kind of at the mercy of a call from a production company to say, "Oh, would you come on this series?" Or "We've got this, film," or going, for interviews for jobs, or what the appetite or the the flavour was for or sort of trends in commissioning, and being a freelancer, that can make you feel quite anxious and sort of quite lonely. But you make films, you can always be doing that, and I think, even if it takes a long time, actually having that project that you kind of keep chipping away at can be creatively and emotionally really sort of helpful to have. It's something that as I kind of go forward and do other work, I always want to have that film that quietly I just know about, that I'm just slowly kind of working on, that will come out when it's ready.
So when I was starting out, I think one of the scary things was, so there's 4 filmmakers on the panel, and we've all taken totally different routes to get to where we've got to today, and that's both really exciting and a strength, and also kind of terrifying, I think, for young filmmakers who are trying to get into the industry, because there's not like one ladder that like once you're on it, you know that if you just keep climbing, you're going to get to where you want to get to. And some of us go to film school and some of us don't. And some of us go and work for the BBC and work our way up there. And some of us say, I want to direct from day one and be a freelancer. And there's no right path. And that's, I think, can be a bit scary, but it's also totally liberating.
Yeah.
And you know, now is such an exciting time because cameras have never been more accessible, more affordable, and you can go and buy these small cameras and you can go and shoot films that can end up in film festivals and look great on cinema screens. And that's like, even 15, 20 years ago, like that wasn't possible. So it feels like a really exciting time for young filmmakers to be able to get their hands on this equipment, and if they find the right story, really create stuff that can make a splash. And I can only talk from my experience, but what I did when I was, I guess, 21, when I came back from America, was, I didn't have any contacts in the industry really, and I had a few people who were a bit older who'd worked in TV, but I remember sitting down and like watching a load of documentaries and just like writing down the feature documentaries that I loved and that in 10, 15 years, like I wanted to be making.
Right.
And I worked out like who were the production companies that made those films and who are the producers that produced those films. And then I emailed one of the producers and was invited to go for a cup of tea, and I've been working with Simon Chin ever since, and he's incredible, and he's been an incredible mentor to me. So that would be one bit of advice, would be to kind of find the films that you want to be making and figure out who makes them and go and see if you can learn from them, or take them out for a coffee and talk to them about how they started their careers and got their films going. And if there is a way as a director especially to build a relationship with producers, that as well can be really beneficial, so that you feel like you're working as a team. And because it is hard to get funding, and if you're working in teams with other people, it can definitely be a more manageable process.
Well, just springboarding off that, I think find collaborators and make sure they're people you can speak to and have a coffee with and argue with, but talk things through. I think that's really the key to really good films as well, are strong teams behind them and good working relationships, because you have to be, you're steering a ship, you all need to be going in the same direction. Tangential, I think, piece of advice is make sure you have friends who aren't filmmakers as well, because it's a tight kind of intense industry, and at the end of the day we're holding a mirror up onto the world, and I find it really helpful sometimes to remember what's happening outside of an edit suite, for example, or I have a friend who's a gardener, and it gives me so much headspace and so much clarity sometimes to speak to other people who are in completely, entirely different professions. And I think we can get it's really valuable to have collaborators and to have strong relationships with people within the industry that you can, ask if you've got issues or question marks, and you can ask technical things or storytelling things, but it's really valuable to actually step out of that and think outside of the film space about the realities of what you're trying to do.
Okay. Right, well, just before, have you got anything to add to that? No? Right, we're going to throw it open to questions. Has anyone got any questions? Okay, lots of questions. Okay, so who's got the microphone? If you just wait for the microphone before you answer the question. So there's a guy here with his arm up there. He's got a question.
I can use my voice.
Okay, good. Go on, go for it.
So, yeah, sure. First question, I've got two questions. First one is, it's really cool working in film, being able to make the films that you are making. One thing that kind of is always at the back of my mind, at least, when I'm thinking about getting into this industry is, how do I fund myself? How do I keep myself, how do I keep food on the table and pay my rent? Especially in a place like London. So, what do you do as your main job when you're not doing filmmaking? You said you work evenings and weekends, so I'm wondering, what do you do during the day? And second question is for Lucy, or for anyone who's taken that approach of filming before you've got a commission. To what extent are you thinking about like the requirements for like commission? Like, do you just go out with a camera and then just film something, and whatever happens, or do you think that, because some people say you need 25 minutes, 30 minutes to shoot this camera, you shoot that camera. So how much of that is about what you do?
Okay, so the first question then, how do you fund yourself? When you're doing your passion project, how do you, which you're not getting paid for, how do you keep food on the table in that part of that process? You go first.
So I spent 4 years making my first feature film. It was a film called Garnet's Gold, which ended up on BBC Storyville, but I think for at least 3 of those 4 years, we didn't have any funding at all. So what I was doing, my day job was doing development work, essentially, which is kind of how I started. So I became a development producer, and with my little backpack of cameras, I would be sent off to go and tell stories and put together sizzle tapes that production companies would then pitch to networks. And again, there's a million different routes to end up directing films, but for me at least, that was an amazingly valuable experience because it teaches you how to go and find stories and also how to pitch stories. And half the battle, even once you've got an amazing story, is trying to get funding for it and learning how to talk to commissioners and pitch your story and develop a vision, a directorial vision, was really, really essential. So I was kind of doing that like as a day job, and then I was in weekends and evenings, at least up to the point where we got funding, I was shooting my feature. And in terms of cameras and stuff, I didn't really think too much about that. I didn't know whether the camera was going to be on the approved tech spec and all that, because I was like 22 and I had no idea really what I was doing. So I just went and shot it. And I sort of feel, at least for your first film, like that's sometimes the only way you can do it, because you have no idea where the story's going to go, let alone whether it's going to end up on the BBC or Netflix. So I took a bit of a risk on it, and we spent a lot of time in post making sure that all of the mistakes that I made in audio and all the rest of it were kind of cleared up. But yeah, you just got to go for it.
Okay.
I take that further and say, always take that risk. Never think about what other people will want spec-wise. You know, make your film, and you can work that out later. If it's important, you know, there are so many different partners, and don't make a film for someone else. Make the film for you. Ultimately, the film will be yours forever, and, you know, you'll have to stand by it forever, so don't think about anyone else. But doing that also means that you might need to find ways to make it possible. Possibly, you know, 90% of the way. For me, I worked in a community centre for years. At the beginning of when I first started producing, I was there for quite a long time. And then I also used to teach at university, teach film, teach visual anthropology, and I've only stopped, and that was my most regular source of income. I only stopped doing that about 2 years ago. So, and I've produced, I think Northern Soul is my 8th feature documentary. So, and it's tricky. Some films are fully funded. Some films were never funded. One of the films I produced last year, or execed last year, Almost Heaven by Carol Salter, was it was a real passion project, but it was one that was never endorsed by any of the funders or commissioners. Nobody ever saw what it was she was trying to do, and it won the BAFTA for Best Documentary last year. It's won a lot of. It's had a lot of critical success, but that wasn't ever something that people saw. They didn't see what it was she was trying to do. And that's the thing that I find hard to resolve. So always have, create the situation so that you can make the films that you want to make, because people don't necessarily know better than you do. And hopefully that film will enable Carol to make her next film more easily, but I don't know. It also requires this industry to change perhaps a little bit, and for people making decisions to change a little bit as well. Okay. Sorry, that's a slightly...
We'll come back to that.
It's a slightly kind of bittersweet response, but that's my honest opinion.
Okay, I'm going to move on. Yes, yep, this lady here.
First of all, I want to apologize. It's not contagious, but I really needed to be here. I wanted to ask you, because you all have different cultures or background. It's a very big world out there. England to me, I've come back. I started my career here, then I went around the world, and I'm based in France now, but it's the top. Documentaries in this country are the best. We have the most honorable, let's say, correct, not the producers, I'm looking for a word, honest, okay? Mm-hmm. But there is huge amount of funding. If you make a co-production deal with France, I'm going off to sunny side of the dock, all they do is look for people like you. And there is so much funding out there and distribution deals and everything, and I just think everyone here should get off the island and see the big world, because I'm shocked at the level of impoverishment here, and especially with Brexit. That's what forced me to leave, to go back to France. So my question is, do you people know about these funding deals? France has a co-production deal with every country in the world, especially Africa, Asia. And the legal thing is important, because in France, you get a lot of quick deals because the country flushes you with things, but you get a lot of legal problems. So how much do you put in your budget for lawyers on negotiations? And this is a Netflix thing, so that is something else. You know that France boycotted Netflix at Cannes, you know. So in your production budget, and I appreciate what you say, that you bring people into the cutting room for the final thing because you're making it with them, you're not exploiting them. So do you think about these elements of legal things and the commissioning things? I grew up with those commissioning things, and everybody went to Eton, Oxford, or Cambridge, and I went, screw that. It's not people who tell stories. So is that a question?
Yeah. Well,
I don't know if that's a question.
So your film ended up on Netflix, Lucy. So it's worth you answering that question about sort of the process of the budgeting. Was there an issue about the legalities of it and things like that? Was that something that...
Well, I think it's slightly specific in the situation of Kingdom with Us, because Netflix came on board sort of 6 weeks before the end of the edit.
Ah, okay.
So this wasn't, you know, although it's a Netflix original, we were very far down the line, and they saw what was largely, you know, close to a final kind of cut of the film. I mean, they were absolutely brilliant to work with, and definitely helped me make the film better or closer to what I wanted it to be. But yeah, we were so far along by then that those things kind of, you know, didn't really become involved. I mean, in terms of kind of involving those things within the budget, I mean, I'm going to slightly defer to Elhum, because I don't know, as a producer, just because I'm not, you know, perhaps would.
But I think there were lots of different questions in a sense. I think legal budgets, it's a tricky one. If it's a commissioned film, then actually there's definitely a line in the budget for legal costs, and those legal costs actually refer to all the contractual work you need to do to engage with that broadcaster or funder. I think part of that question is maybe about ethical question marks, in a sense, and that's very much the relationship you build with your contributors or the people you're making the film with, and that's different, and that's something you can't necessarily, you know, you can write up a release form, and but that's very much that personal, that's the contract that you build in the relationship.
These negotiations that you make, are you available to make production deals with Germany, with France, with Spain, with Italy?
Of course, but co-productions, you know, it's a two-way process as well. So actually, if you co-produce with France, then what they need to see in the film is the possibility to invest. You know, so there will be part of the film that's made in France, or you will be spending money in France. It's not just money that's potentially there. I think one of the risks of the way that things are going in this country and Brexit is that we are more and more isolated as an island, and that co-productions for other countries with the UK aren't very interesting. You know, it's interesting for us as producers or directors if we're making a film that has some sort of connection to another country to produce with a producer or company in that country. But there's no interest for another country to come and produce with a UK producer unless, you know, the only thing that we can bring is our creative assets, well, which is great, but it would be great if we're supported more by being able to draw from, for example, the tax credit, which isn't written for documentaries. We're not hugely supported. You know, it doesn't make sense for most documentaries to apply for the tax credit. Most of them can't. It's probably too technical, maybe, for this space. But co-productions are possible. I've produced with Japan, with France, with Ireland, but...
Yeah. Okay, fine. We've got lots of hands, so we're going to move on. Thank you very much for your question. Right, do you want to, if we sort of go round, so if we do the people at this side So the first is, yeah, and then go up, and then we'll sort of come round to everybody.
Hello?
Hello.
Oh, hi. Firstly, thank you for all your answers. They've been very insightful and helpful. But I wondered if any of you have worked in a country or with contributors where you don't share the same language, because I feel like I see a lot of quite established directors, you know, making films in Syria, for example, and I think that they don't speak the language, and I just really wonder how that plays out, because, I mean, with documentary, that relationship is probably the most important thing. And then I kind of get answers where, oh, you get a fixer or you get a translator, but I just still can't quite envision how that takes place. But I don't know if...
Right.
Yeah.
Has anyone had an experience of that?
Yeah.
Have you? No? No?
So I've produced a lot of films in other countries. Syrian love stories, so Syria you mentioned. Actually, Sean speaks only English, and everyone else's English got much better throughout the course of the 5 years. And it's interesting. A lot of people have said things like, you know, the family were forced to speak English to speak to Sean. That's not quite right. They weren't speaking in their own words. And actually, the film is very much also about the relationship they have to each other. So it wouldn't have made sense as a film for them to speak in Arabic and for Sean to speak to a fixer or a translator. Ultimately, that film came about through a relationship. And even if when he first met Amr, who's one of the father of the family and the first person he met, they had another shared language. You know, they met in a bar and they got along, and you know, Amr told him about his situation and his life in that language of not language that we can also have as human beings, and that's where it all began. With Almost Heaven or Even When I Fall, so one was in China, the other in Nepal. So both sets, all those directors from the UK, they worked sometimes with fixers and translators, but also built relationships as human beings again. With Even When I Fall, it was filmed over so long and with a number of people and in a language that nobody ever picked up from our team. So we were very reliant on people to translate a lot of the time. But it was also very important for the filmmakers to find ways to give real agency, and so that's where performative elements within the film really kind of they kind of came to the fore a lot more. And again, over the course of the 7 years, all the Nepali contributors learned to speak English a lot better than Sky and Kate spoke Nepali. I think it's very much that first human relationship and language secondary, but ensuring that people can speak in their own voice, however it is that you're doing that.
Okay, brilliant, thank you. There was the guy at the back. He's all behind you, sorry, thank you.
Yeah, hi there. One of the things that sort of really resonated with me was just this sense of like carrying a burden. That, you know, the film is your thing to find, and you're carrying this thing for a long time. And one of the things I think I've struggled with is that balance of the supporting cast around you and making sure you have those people, but then not losing your film that you want to find. And I was just wondering, how have you managed that balance between talking to people and bringing them aboard, but also staying true to what the film you want to find and giving yourself time to find it?
Okay, do you want to take that, Ayo? No? Yeah?
Yeah,
No.
I think it's just really simple. You have your vision of what you want the film or what you want it to be. You interview lots of people, and then you find the best fit.
I mean, I can add to that a little bit. I mean, I think it's really important to collaborate with people who whose judgment and taste is in line with yours and who you trust. And for me, at least, the most important relationship has been with the producer I work with a lot. And I know that whatever footage I bring back into the cutting room, he'll make sure that the very best film comes out the door. And there's a huge amount of trust that goes into those relationships. And hopefully you're working as a director and a producer and as a team with people who, if you come with a directing vision, they believe in that and they want to empower you to follow through and be ambitious with it, and to kind of make your film. But I think it's always that balance as a director. You know, when you're working with editors and these amazing other collaborators, you need to allow them to also give their thoughts. And I think if you're too like, well, only my vision, and I don't want anyone else kind of impeding on that at all, then that can be, maybe that's how some people work. But for me, at least, that collaborative process is really important. And you know, as a 32-year-old, knowing that, you know, next week I'm going to be a better filmmaker than I am today, and in 10 years I'll be a much better filmmaker, hopefully, and working with people who are better than you, who have done more things, who have got more experience, and learning from them is all part of the process. I would also say, though, that as a director, you do need to kind of, and it's a hard thing, but you sort of grow a bit of sort of a granite backbone, and just, you know, if you have a vision, you do need to feel and get the strength to pitch that and be confident that it's good and try and follow through with it, whilst also taking on other people's views and adapting and moving. But you do need a strong vision. I think it helps hugely.
Can I just add to that as well? Because it's something that I found really hard. Because I feel like sometimes when you're out there and you're filming, all you're doing is responding, and you're listening, and you're responding, you're listening, and this is what you do and what you do well, and you do that. And then you get into the cutting room and you've got your vision, and you're need to stick by that. And then whenever I get notes, I'd be responding and reacting and responding and reacting, and it's kind of felt like I was having to switch on quite a sort of different like part of me in a sense, and found it kind of quite complicated to do, and think I've got kind of better at understanding when I can take things on board, take what I need from those things, and perhaps think about, you know, why I'm getting those notes or those thoughts, even if I don't quite agree with it, where does it come from? And looking at things in a different way, and those times when I just need to, like, okay, now I just need to focus, enough thoughts, enough kind of feedback. But I mean, I've had kind of like real meltdowns over the difficulty. And I have the most wonderful producer that I work with, and she'd always say to me, but, you know, these are just notes. You don't have to just take what you want. You don't have to take them if they don't agree. And I remember using an analogy, which I sort of stand by. I said it felt a bit like you've got a big night, you put on this, like, dress that you're really excited about wearing, and you go out, and someone goes, oh, are you wearing that? And you're like, oh, why? Don't you like it? I mean, it's fine. I just thought that you might wear something, I don't know, a little bit shorter or this. But the most important thing is you're comfortable. Wear what you want. And so you go, okay, then, I'll do what I was going to do. And you go out, but you still feel a bit shit. Because you've got in the back of your mind, maybe this doesn't really work. And so, like, notes are dangerous. And I think people who write the notes need to be really responsible as well for how they're writing, and take the time to get the tone right, and always have a conversation. Don't just do things on paper. I think that can be really difficult, because it's so hard to weigh up how important that is to that person, or whether that was just, you know, a runaway thought when they were doing something else. And it's so I think, you know, definitely talk about it, because they do have an impact, and it can be really positive, but it can also be damaging for, you know, particularly I found when you're starting out, because I mean, you know, it's really important that you question and yourself all the time, but, you know, you can get sort of riddled with self-doubt and end up losing your instinct. And if you've lost that, you can't make a film. So.
Okay, thank you. Next question.
Can I just add something?
Sorry, go on,
I think there is something about the process of making, particularly documentary, that is vulnerable. And when you're taking this kind of leap of faith into a story and a narrative, you're in a really vulnerable space. And that's where your collaborators are really key to also help work out and kind of, you know, work out where you stand. But where this instinct or the vision, you know, feedback can kind of sometimes make you question certain things. What will never, ever change is why you're doing what you're doing. And you might be working that out along the way, but why you're doing it is never going to change. So if that's really clear, that's the thing you can come back to, even when you've completely lost your way.
Yeah.
And it's a really vulnerable process, so you might well lose your way, but that's the thing that you can hold on to.
There is also, very finally, one thing which I think is important to realise, that you know, the broadcaster or the network that you're working with is in some way also that's a really important collaboration. And in a perfect world, you're going to want to, you have a vision for your film, and you're going to want to try and match that vision up with the network, because clearly every strand, a BBC Three film is going to have a different tone and sensibility and feel to a BBC Four Storyville film, and that's going to be different again to Channel 4 or to Netflix. And obviously, getting funding from anyone is difficult. So if you're in a position where you can choose between different options, that's amazing. But it is important to kind of match up your vision and try to make sure that you're working with people who support that vision. And otherwise, it can be a difficult relationship if you're feeling you're having to try and twist what you're doing to fit into a sort of different sized whole.
Great, thank you very much. Sorry, we'll take the lady at the front and we'll come back. So do you want to go first, this lady at the front here? Yeah.
I just wanted to hear about the way you construct your narratives. When some people storyboard, some people find their way through the interviews by cutting through. So yeah, if you could share your tips, your ideas, and when do you actually start constructing a narrative?
I think for me, particularly on Kingdom of Us, I generated a lot of footage over 3 years, and also there was over 100 hours of archive as well. So there was quite a lot to move through. Now, in this particular case, there was a very strong backstory for the family, but the editor and I, in terms of putting that together, I guess I construct things at treatment stage and as I go along, but they're kind of always subject to change. But I would say I cut for character as opposed to story, looking at the material. And it's with the character and, revealing those moments and really kind of getting inside that psychology that then moves the narrative. I don't plot, in a sense, because story's what's internal anyway, not what happens. So, and I find it can be quite dangerous to plot out what happens, and then you can have a great plot, but you haven't got a story because you're not following the person through it because you haven't found character, if that makes sense. So I will kind of look for the scenes that might have nothing to do with the plot, but where there's something that reveals character, which I think is going to draw us in, and then see how that kind of weaves in as it goes along, as opposed to sort of, bashing it out, this happens and that happens and that happens and that happens. But, getting motivation.
Ayo, how do you do it?
With Street 66, I started it with how I wanted people to feel. And so then I started with research. But because the film is heavy on archive, if I didn't have access to archive, there wouldn't be any story. So the idea was to get as much archive as I can, get the contributors, make sure my research was on point, and then piece it all together. But it was a new way of working. I've never worked with archive, so it was quite scary. No one told me how it would be. Yeah.
Okay. Elhum?
I've just started working on an archive project, and another filmmaker gave me some great advice, which was to look at it as if we'd shot it all. And I think that was quite interesting.
Archive's expensive, so...
Yeah, at the point where you're kind of constructing the story, before you've looked into any of that.
Sorry.
No, that you can go.
I think a lot of people say, especially with documentary on Obstock, you find the film in the edit, and I think there's a lot of truth to that. But I found that, and going back to what I was saying earlier about at an early stage, if you can try to film and learn to edit, if you know what it means to be given someone else's footage and be sitting at your computer and trying to work out how the hell to edit it into a story, that can actually be a really useful lesson when you're out directing your own films, because I at least find that I'm constantly thinking about what I'm going to be doing in the edit room, and I'm constantly thinking about story and narrative and making sure that, while I'm open to the spontaneous and to scenes that aren't directly linked to story development but are more about character, I find myself in the back of my head constantly thinking about the edit and trying to structure scenes in that way. That's at least my experience of it.
Okay, great. Thank you. Next question. I'm sort of, we work backwards. Yes, Del. Thank you.
Hi. Thank you. So you've got the idea, you've got the vision, you've got the characters and the relationships in place, and you've never used a camera before. Is it worth training to, or just start filming, just start pressing a button? Any advice on that one?
I mean, I was never been taught how to use a camera, and I mean, before I made this film, I, shot, stuff, other things over a period of time. And I think the first time I did, which even was sort of for a broadcaster, I mean, I just get stuck in. I mean, you learn it as you go along. I mean, perhaps, hopefully the first thing you shoot isn't your most important scene. Yeah, I think you just absolutely learn from your mistakes. I mean, it's the best thing. I mean, I'm sure I would be much better if I have been trained, and I've definitely got better. But at the same time, it's even just being told things. I mean, you just learn by doing. So it's and also there's a really, it is technical in a certain way, and I'm not technical, at all. And there's, filming and being able to film, it is not about touching the buttons. It's just what you're seeing, and you're seeing the story, seeing the story, or you're seeing this, you're seeing that there. And if you can point it and press record, and somehow what's going on there is kind of going through there, and in some way, then that's the most important thing. It's not knowing, things can be corrected, in the edit as well. I mean, yeah. So I just go.
I'm really, really sorry, but that's all we've got time for. We can't take any more questions. But the great thing about Sheffield is that you will bump into all these people again, and I'm sure if you see them around Sheffield and you've got a question for them, you can sort of or we can stay outside or whatever. You can grab hold of people. So I just want to say thank you very much to all our panelists. If we could give them a round of applause.